And now it is my distinct and unique pleasure to introduce Andrew J. Peters, a class of 2011 Lambda Fellow in genre fiction.
So, in honor of Elizabeth, I'll be reading Lesbian Erotica. This is an excerpt from my young adult fantasy, The Seventh Lady. It's a queer retelling of the last days of Atlantis. The scene has the main character, Arander, at a temple ceremony when the kingdom is confronting the fall of a military defense, unrelenting sea storm, and the appearance of a star that has not been sighted for centuries. It wasn't until he was seated on a forebench at the Temple of Poseidon, saturated by the stone-cloistered air, that he realized what was happening. The temple service, the startling gravity of hundreds of boys gathered together, the firstborn celebrants from each of the 10 royal houses, and many hundreds of commoner sons, packed into the enormous building, all the way back to its vestibule. Each one was wrapped on the ancient cella pillar, which was dappled in light and shadow from the brazier pit. Arander reckoned things dizzily. He was in the middle of the temple's front row, Dardi to one side of him, Perdiccas on the other, and Lysimachos, a safe distance away 3 boys down. A group of priests fed bundles of sage into the brazier and traveled around the cella pedestal with kettles, scattering sanctified salts from the beds of the island's hot springs. Zazamuk appeared from the quarantine gates, and a hush washed through the chamber. His face shined from purifying oils. He wore his layered ceremonial robes, and a bull's horn hung from his neck, an artifact of the priest's brutal traditions. Zazamuk stepped up to the pedestal, and Hefid wheeled behind him a wooden crate large enough for a man to crouch inside. The box was crudely crafted and unadorned. Based on Hefid's effort to pull it up the ramp, it must have been heavy. Arander figured what was inside, tokens bearing the names of every firstborn son in the city. The collective anticipation was an invisible force, tightening in from all directions. Arander felt short of breath, his palms sweated, and the floor beneath his feet was suddenly unsteady. He told himself there was nothing to be afraid of. It was just the priest's theatrics. The kingdom was undergoing tough times, but, as his father said, he ought to stand strong against the urge to panic. Whatever happened that night was merely ceremonial, the noble class's indulgence of the priest to keep them happy. Still, his mind could not quell the reaction of his body. Next to him, Dardi was drained of color, and his hands were fastened to the bench. Zazamuk paced the altar with a bony finger tracing a line in front of him. Who shall answer the call of our ancestral father? Who among you can pledge the purity of your devotion to the eternal king? He whose trident spear shakes the earth, he who claims the ocean, he whose wrath can only be appeased by the oath of a true believer. His eyes scanned the chamber, and his thin lips pursed with a hint of derision. That haughty look sliced through Arander. He stared boldly at the priest. What right did he have to judge them? Was he implying that the storm, the tremors, the barbarians invading the kingdom were their fault? Zazamuk went over to the box and raised his claw-like hand in front of him. My hand is guided by the will of our Creator. Let no man dispute who he has chosen. Hefid unlatched the lid of the box and stepped back to the shadows of the altar. Zazamuk reached inside the box's rounded opening. The clink of stone tiles whispered through the chamber. It seemed like everyone was holding their breath until his hand would reappear. Zazamuk pulled his hand out, clasped into a fist, and lifted it high above him. The ceiling cupola scraped open. There was a shriek of wind, and a cylinder of rain wept down on Zazamuk's upturned, delighted face. He has chosen. The congregants stirred uneasily. Zazamuk uncupped his hand and showed the polished towel to the audience. Of course, the name inscribed was too small for anyone to read, but they stared at it with wide faces. Zazamuk took his time, walking from one end of the pedestal to the other, before he brought the token to the level of his eyes. He looked out to the room. Attalus, son of Gryllus, the pawnbroker,